Have you ever wondered how an entire town can disappear from the map in just 72 hours? How thousands of people can vanish while the world watches, and how those responsible think they can simply bury the evidence and walk away? Well, on July 11th, 1995, that's exactly what happened in a small town called Srebrenica. What unfolded there over the next 3 days would become the worst act of mass murder in Europe since World War II. But this isn't just a story about what happened during those 72 hours. It's about how meticulous planning, systematic execution, and an elaborate cover-up operation turned a United Nations designated safe area into the site of genocide. The events at Srebrenica didn't happen by accident. They were the result of careful coordination, deliberate choices, and a complete breakdown of international protection systems. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened, but how investigators pieced together one of the most comprehensive criminal investigations in modern history. You'll see how forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and even aerial photographs revealed the true scope of these crimes. But first, let me give you some context about just how extensive this investigation became. We're talking about a crime scene covering 2,800 square kilometers, involving at least 7,000 victims, and requiring nearly 2 decades to fully document. The International Criminal Tribunal examined over 130 mass graves, analyzed thousands of pieces of evidence, and ultimately indicted 19 individuals for their roles in these crimes. So let's start at the beginning, with the town of Srebrenica itself. Srebrenica was a small mining town in eastern Bosnia, surrounded by Serb-controlled territory during the Bosnian War. By 1993, it had become a refuge for thousands of Bosniak Muslims fleeing the violence that was tearing apart the former Yugoslavia. The situation was desperate. People were trapped, supplies were running low, and Bosnian Serb forces had the town completely surrounded. That's when the United Nations stepped in. On April 16, 1993, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 819, officially declaring Srebrenica a safe area under international protection. The idea was simple: create a demilitarized zone where civilians could find safety, protected by UN peacekeepers. But as we'll see, the reality was far more complicated. The UN deployed a contingent of Dutch peacekeepers, known as Dutch Bat 3, to monitor this safe area. But here's the problem. These weren't combat troops ready for war. They were lightly armed peacekeepers with a mandate that prohibited them from using force except in self-defense. 370 Dutch soldiers were tasked with protecting an enclave that housed over 40,000 people, completely surrounded by hostile forces. The Dutch battalion arrived in January 1995. Already facing impossible conditions, they were undersupplied, under-equipped, and their superiors at UN command in Sarajevo were unwilling to provide extensive support. Their mandate wasn't clearly defined, and Dutch military officials had made no effort to gather detailed intelligence about what was actually happening in the Srebrenica area. By July 1995, the situation had become even more precarious. The number of peacekeepers had dwindled to just 400, and they were poorly supplied. Meanwhile, Bosnian Serb forces under the command of General Ratko Mladic were preparing for what they called Operation Krivaja 95. On July 6, 1995, Mladic ordered his troops to launch their all-out attack on Srebrenica. The offensive began with Bosnian Serb forces advancing from the south, systematically burning Bosniak homes along the way. What's striking about this assault is how little resistance they encountered. The Bosnian army forces in the enclave were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The Dutch peacekeepers were constrained by their mandate, and NATO air support was nowhere to be found. As Serb forces advanced, Dutch peacekeepers requested NATO airstrikes twice to halt the advance. Both times, UN commanders rejected the requests. It wasn't until July 11th that bombing was finally approved, but by then it was too little, too late. By July 10th, Bosnian Serb army soldiers were on the outskirts of Srebrenica, and nothing could stop their advance into the supposedly protected safe area. The next day, July 11th, General Mladic himself strolled through the streets of Srebrenica. In a statement recorded on film by a Serb journalist, he declared, "We give this town to the Serb nation." But the fall of Srebrenica was just the beginning. What happened next would transform this military victory into something far more sinister. On July 12th, Bosnian Serb forces began systematically separating men between the ages of 16 and 65 from women and children in the UN safe area. This separation process wasn't random or chaotic. It was methodical, organized, and deliberately planned. The separation happened right at the UN compound in Potokari, where thousands of desperate civilians had sought shelter. Bosnian Serb soldiers moved through the crowds, pulling men and older boys from their families. Mothers watched helplessly as their sons were dragged away. Wives saw their husbands disappear into buses and trucks that would take them to their deaths. What makes this separation so chilling is how systematic it was. The soldiers had lists. They knew exactly who they were looking for. This wasn't the heat of battle or some spontaneous act of violence. This was cold, calculated genocide in action. Meanwhile, about 15,000 men and boys had decided not to wait for the Serbs to come to them. They formed a massive column and attempted to flee through the forests toward Bosnian government-controlled territory. It was a desperate gamble. They knew the woods were filled with Serb forces, but staying meant certain death. Most of them never made it. Over the next 72 hours, starting on July 13th, 1995, a systematic massacre began. Bosnian Serb execution sites across the Region B forces had prepared multiple. These weren't random locations. They were carefully chosen buildings and areas where large numbers of people could be killed efficiently and the evidence could be managed. The first mass execution took place at a warehouse in Kravica on July 13th. At least 1,000 men were killed there in a single day. Survivors who managed to escape described how prisoners were packed into the building. Then soldiers opened fire with automatic weapons and threw grenades inside. The killing continued until no one was left alive. But Kravica was just the beginning. Between July 14th and 16th, the killing operation expanded to multiple locations across the region. At Orahovac, between 800 and 2,500 people were executed. At Petkovci, more than 800 prisoners were shot. At Kozluk, over 1,000 men were killed. At the Branjevo Farm and Cultural Centre in Pilica, between 1,000 and 2,000 people were murdered. Each execution site followed a similar pattern. Prisoners would be transported in buses or trucks, often told they were being taken for prisoner exchanges. Instead, they were led to fields, schools, warehouses, or other buildings where they were lined up and shot. Many had their hands tied behind their backs. Many were blindfolded. The forensic evidence later recovered by investigators painted a horrific picture. At mass grave sites, forensic experts found 138 blindfolds at one location alone. Shell casings littered execution sites. Explosive residue showed where grenades had been used to finish off survivors. But here's what makes the Srebrenica massacre even more disturbing. The killing wasn't enough for those who orchestrated it. They knew the world was watching. They knew international investigators would eventually come looking. So they planned an elaborate cover-up operation that was almost as extensive as the massacre itself. The forensic investigation that followed revealed the true scale of this systematic genocide. Over 130 mass graves were discovered and examined. Bodies had been moved multiple times to hide the evidence, with remains of single individuals found 30 kilometers apart. The International Criminal Tribunal's 2-decade investigation stands as the most comprehensive criminal investigation in modern European history, proving beyond doubt that what happened at Srebrenica was not the chaos of war, but calculated, methodical genocide. The evidence speaks for itself. the testimonies cannot be silenced, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface.